let's take a look at the central nervous system, which most of the time we think of as the brain. But it's important to remember that in addition to the brain, we also have a brain stem and spinal cord extending down into the back. So the spinal cord is connected to the lowest part of the brainstem, the medulla or medulla oblongata. Then we have the pons, and the pons is connected to the cerebellum, this large expansion here that we'll see going posteriorly. Superior to the pons, we have the midbrain. And we'll see superior to the midbrain, we can't see it on the model just now, but we'll see it later when we take it apart, is the thalamus. Now, superior to the thalamus is the rest of what we think of as the brain proper. And these are the cerebral hemispheres. And we can see that we have a left and right cerebral hemisphere, and they are separated by the interhemispheric fissure here. Now, in addition to these big gaps like the interhemispheric fissure, we'll notice lots of little ravines and grooves and bumps all over the surface of the brain. The raised areas are called gyri, and the separations between them that are kind of punched in, those are sulci. So sulcus or sulci, gyrus or gyri, and these are grouped into different lobes of the brain. We have the frontal lobe, appropriately facing forward, going right ahead there, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe most posteriorly, and then we have a temporal lobe here. Flipping to this side, we can see that there is a large lateral fissure separating the temporal lobe from the parietal and frontal. And there's actually a hidden lobe that we can actually get a peek at in this model that's overgrown by the frontal and temporal. And this is called the insular lobe. So insular lobe is present, but on this model and in real life, you have to kind of pry the temporal lobe away from the parietal and frontal to get a good look at that insular lobe. We'll now continue by making what we refer to as a sagittal cut going through here, and we'll take a look here at this right side on the sagittal plane, and we can see, one, that the two hemispheres are connected by this large structure running between them. It's actually full of axons traveling from right to left and left to right. This is called the corpus callosum. And now we'll return to a slightly different view of our brainstem. Once again, medulla oblongata, pons, cerebellum, midbrain here, and then the thalamus we're just beginning to see here. It's going to be a large, kind of about golf ball sized structure, maybe a little smaller, on the left and the right. And what I want you to note now is that we can see here that the thalamus has some associated areas. Here, just inferior to it, is the hypothalamus, going to be a very important signaling area for basic drives and the things that allow us to stay alive. And we have the epithalamus, more commonly known as the pineal gland, just here. So that's going to be involved in keeping us, cycling properly from daytime to nighttime, getting our body ready for sleep. And then, shifting over to this side, the makers of this model have decided to include the pituitary gland. It doesn't really look like a little wire, but the pituitary gland does hang inferiorly from the hypothalamus, and that's going to be one of our major endocrine organs, helping us to make changes in the body to support growth and regulation of metabolic activity. In addition, the brain contains multiple fluid-filled cavities. These are called ventricles, and they create what is known as cerebrospinal fluid. There's a structure inside of them that filters the blood. It's called the choroid plexus, but it filters the blood to create CSF, and the CSF is created in the lateral ventricles. Here we have the one on the left, and here on the right side, we can see that the septum pellucidum is this. It's a membrane that sits between the right and left lateral ventricles. So they don't actually communicate directly with each other. They have this membrane, septum pellucidum, separating them, and there would be a cavity just as large as the other side, just behind this membrane. Cerebrospinal fluid produced in the lateral ventricles drains through an interventricular foramen, right about here, into this midline space. That's going to be right between the thalamus on each side and the hypothalamus, and this is the third ventricle. So third ventricle is going to meet up with a fourth ventricle down here between the pons, the medulla, and the cerebellum, and to get there it has to travel through this small canal right here. This is the cerebral aqueduct. So once again, from lateral ventricle, on the right and left, we go through the interventricular foramen to the third ventricle. More CSF is going to be added there by choroid plexus, traveling through the cerebral aqueduct, which is the narrowest part of the pathway, to reach the fourth ventricle. Now in the fourth ventricle, the CSF is continuous to the central canal of the spinal cord, but there's actually a median, midline, and two lateral apertures that allow the CSF to leave the inside of the central nervous system and surround it. And that surrounding of CSF is what keeps us from getting jostled and having our brain get bruised every time we move our head. And it's in a place called the subarachnoid space. And it's going to be just between the pia mater, the outermost layer of the brain, and the arachnoid mater, which is a kind of flimsy, cobweb-like layer protecting the brain here. The CSF is between them. And on the outside of all of it is what's known as the dura mater. We have a little bit of a model of it here. The dura mater would surround the entire system, but it would also have a falx, or an area here, going down between the individual hemispheres in that interhemispheric fissure. Alright, so let's put this all back together now. We can see CNS has been reestablished here. If we take a look at what it actually looks like on the inside, what this model is depicting is good. What we see is that the outer layer of the cortex contains our gray matter. These are the nerve cell bodies. So the actual neurons, the nerve cells, are on the outside of the central nervous system of the brain. And then here in the hemispheres we have white matter leaving the gray matter. Those are the axons carrying information from the nerve cells to other places in the brain or brainstem or spinal cord. So we have these individual gyri giving rise to white matter. Here, on the underside of the brain, we can see once again our cerebellum, and we take that off, and we have the same basic principle at play. The outside of the gyri here are very, very numerous. We can see them there, and they're actually called folia because someone looked at them and thought they looked like leaves. And to keep that metaphor going, the folia sticking up off of each individual gyrus there gives off white matter that travels centrally to do the work of the cerebellum. And because it forms this kind of a pattern, it's also known as the arbor vitae, or the tree of life. And that's just about as poetic as neuroscience gets.